Yorana, talofa, kia ora, good evening, it's night time and I am here. My name is Cherie Chu-Fuluifaga and welcome to our EDUC 322 lecture on racism, COVID-19 and education. And I hope everybody is well and happy in their current state, in their current place, in their current context. Right, so here we are in terms of our lockdown. These are some of the images that we have been navigating in the past few weeks, the past month. It seems like a very long time. Obviously, for myself and my husband, Elia, and daughter Celia, we have some crazy times, but we love being outside. We love being in our garden. We love eating. We love creating food because that is our way of being together. That is our relationship. That is our enjoyment, and that is the way we learn and flourish together. And so we could all have different images if we put it on a slideshow about how we might be spending time in the past in our lockdown, level 4, level 3, as it continues. But what I want to emphasize is that this is obviously a new experience for us as educators and students and staff in the university and the community. And I want to acknowledge the fact that this is an evolving time, but an evolving time that is full of generosity in terms of what has occurred in the last few months in terms of people listening and being socialized and being educated around COVID-19 to make the right decisions. And that comes to what our course is about, multi-ethnic education. Let's recap what we are about in terms of our re-engagement, our re-exploration. It's been obviously a few weeks. We've attended to our first assignment, which focused on an examination of ourselves as people of ethnicities, of cultures, of people who have different upbringings or similar upbringings. We come from different countries, we've had different experiences. Some of us admit that we have been privileged, and what does privileged mean? But we don't judge because we all come with different experiences that make us who we are. So for us, the starting point is that we start with our knowledge, we start with our values, our beliefs, our ideas, and we acknowledge those because then that helps us center who we are, and we are more cognizant of the ways we are operating in terms of our behavior, our ideas, our attitudes to others, because to be better educators, we must know ourselves. We must know who we are in terms of our identities, our cultures, our places of belonging, our specific values, our beliefs, perhaps some of our prejudices, our judgment calls that we make on others. So starting with ourselves in this course is critical. And I appreciate the honesty and the reflections that you've had shared with Sean and I in terms of your first assignment. And we are always very grateful that you will put so much effort into the first assignment in terms of the reflection and the sharing of your life story with us, your narrative, because that's uniquely yours, and to put that on paper is a whole new experience and quite challenging for some of us that don't use the I in university essays. So thank you. So now we are moving into the middle phase of the course, and we are also combining this with an experience of being remote learners. I'm not with you, Sean's not with you. We can't be in a lecture room together, we can't vibe off each other. We can't have our talanoa, our discussion so freely. We are being political, we are challenging, we are debating, discussing concepts and ideas. But this now means that we have to take it to a virtual space where it is compounded by a time that is unknown to all of us in this world. No one has lived through this. We are the first people to wear this. We are the first generation of young university learners that are experiencing this and shifting paradigms. What does that mean for the relationships that we have had in the university as learners, as students, with teachers, with lecturers? We don't have our peers anymore so accessible. So we appreciate this change. We appreciate the involvement that and the impact that it will have on relationships. And we also pull in there the notion of well-being, that we care for ourselves, that we care for our being, that we care for our mind, our body, our nourishment of life, that we look after what really matters. And so if we take it back to lockdown 4, to the changing time, that suddenly things have really impacted on our income, on our lives. Some of us are still away from our families. Some of us are more isolated with our families. Some of us are in different types of circumstances that we never would have imagined. Even for some of our peers that have gone back overseas who were part of our class, we miss you. We know that you've had to go back because of A, B, and C. So what does this all mean? And we are all at different places of experiences, and so that comes to the third point, is the one size does not fit all in online or remote learning, teaching and learning. And so we have to go back to that cliche, one size does not fit all in this time, when we are thinking about learning and teaching, because of our different narratives, because of our different experiences. And so what do we need better to do to look after people so that we are still learning, that we are still being the people who we are in our identities and our cultures and our ethnicities, and that we remain to be Māori, we remain to be Tongan, we remain to be Chinese, we remain to be Pākehā, and so forth. So these are big questions, and it's a time to embrace these questions and these critical debates and discussions as young learners, and I really encourage you to take that and embrace it. So let's just have a little recap around the realities for this country, which I will bring obviously into the forefront of our discussion in our Zoom class on Monday. So we know that through our courses in education, we're a country, we're a complex society. We have an historically inherited system through colonization with the British government in the past. We have the treaty, Te Tiriti o Waitangi, with a certain history of race relations. We have tangata whenua, indigenous peoples that are striving to be the first peoples of this land with their rights. Are we bicultural? Are we existing as bicultural people? Or are we truly beyond that? Are we multi-ethnic? Are we multicultural? Are we multiracial? What does that mean for this country? And we appreciate the history, and we appreciate the learnings that many of us have had at the university through Māori studies, through Pacific studies, through education, where we can learn about our country's identities, our friends' identities, our own identities. And so there are stories, there are narratives, and that we have particular challenges because of our history of colonization. And we could ask, how do we know about our history? What do we get to learn? How do we understand this? And who gets to present the knowledge? And if we were in class, I could ask you the question is, how many of us have learnt about Māori history in our schooling system? And the important point for this is that how do we acknowledge the tangata whenua, how do we recognize their status as first people of this land? And we know that we hear about the racism in the system. We hear about racist comments about Māori, about Pacific. But can education help that? Can education help to socialize people's attitudes and beliefs in a more appreciative way so that we coexist together? So let us ask, who are we as a society, as a New Zealand society, as a multi-ethnic society, as a bicultural society or country? Who are we in terms of our relationships as people? And how are we educated about our past? Or how have we not been educated about our past? Maybe the other question that we could ask. And we will come back to why this is an important question. And we know that for many of us that are growing up in Aotearoa, New Zealand, or in other countries that are multi-ethnic, that our experiences, our ways of life are differentiated by our cultural background. The fact that some of us have experienced different types of racism in our lives is testament or evidence to some of the racism that goes on in Aotearoa, New Zealand, but also the world. That it's not just about name calling, but it's the microaggressions. It is the fact that we may not get served in a line when we are the first in that line. And so what are the realities of this country and the fact that we may not be fully aware of our history, that we as people have different experiences, we have different realities, and this is also dependent on our skin color. And that is my dog in the background, if you can hear that noise. So as a society, as a New Zealand society, if we go back to that question, is who is New Zealand as a society? How do we find commitment? How do we locate this commitment to finding solutions to social problems? That the fact that we have underachievement in this country, that some of us live in poverty, that some of us have poorer outcomes, because we are Māori or because we are Pacific, that we need to work together in communities. So I just hit Brady on the nose. That's my dog. It's a bit naughty. To find ways through challenge so that we are living with more prosperity, with more generosity, with more togetherness, and the fact that we don't have to be talking about Pacific students underachievement or Māori underachievement for the next 50 years, that we don't have to be the brown people who are in the cars, living in our cars, living on the streets, or in the prisons, that we have to be critical, we have to question maybe existing for some specific cultural ethnic groups in this country. So let's go to a definition explanation. So if we take this word race, which is a commonly used term in the United States and Canadian contexts, this notion of race, it's a socially constructed concept. I'm just going to hide my video there so you can see the PowerPoint. And it's a socially constructed concept where we are looking at trying to identify a group of people, identify people in relation to other groups in other settings. So very typical example is of course black and white people, or Pākehā and Māori. So that this notion of race is about a racial group being historically positioned and locally defined by other groups in society. And this comes from a biological explanation, but also a socially constructed concept. Fear comes from a lack of knowledge. It can be misjudgment and stereotyping. So racial categories are about trying to compartmentalize and isolate people, to suggest that there are ways that they interrelate with one another, that they identify their place in the world in relation to others. And so these categories can evolve in relation to the historical circumstances, to social circumstances, and of course economic conditions. And race is not is dynamic, in the sense that if something major happens in a historical time, then this may greatly affect a racial group and the way that they are positioned in society. So with the term race, we can see in the literature and the research there have been attempts by theorists, by certain academics, that attempt to link race, such as physical characteristics, with other characteristics such as intelligence, morality, physical prowess, or personality traits. Back in the day, there were some intelligence experts, researchers, who were basically saying that Black African American people had poor intelligence, so they were born with poor intelligence or no intelligence, and they wrote about this. They tried to research it. They scripted it, and it unfortunately influenced a lot of agendas going on in the United States at the time. And so we have to be critical. We have to think about where this research comes from, or where any type of research comes from, and whose perspective does it represent, and who wrote it, who researched it, were Māori involved, were African American involved, were Pacific people involved, and this is where we have to theorize, and we have to test these theories with a critical perspective. So if we looking at racism in this course of EDUC 322, we can take these words: power plus prejudice equals racism. That is a very clear, simple formula or explanation in terms of what racism equates to. Power plus prejudice equals racism. Therefore, people who have power, who are located in power or have positions of power, who have knowledge power or economic power, for example, and you combine that with the judgmental prejudice, discrimination, the belief system that, for example, that brown boys sit at the back of a classroom, therefore they are dumb. That is a prejudice. Combine that with being powerful as a teacher or a principal, that will lead to obviously further racism, and not just an explicit racism about saying I'm racist because I use names, call people names or something, but it's also inherent in the way that we run our schools, we run our systems, that policies may be written up to represent these types of values and beliefs in terms of racism. And so we have to be, again, cautious as to what knowledge is represented, whose knowledge is represented, and how is that expressed through our processes of education, through our processes of being with one another, through our processes of health and education. And so if we look at COVID-19, for example, is who has the power in this current time. It is, of course, the state of emergency dictated power is through the government. Who are the representatives of the government? Who make the decisions about health? How does this affect Pacific people, for example, in South Auckland, or in Wainuiomata, or in Porirua? How do our policies reflect our contexts and our needs? So racism essentially is the belief in this bullet point, is the belief that groups of humans people possess different behavioral traits corresponding to physical appearance and can be divided based on the superiority of one race over another. So again, this notion of power, superiority, that one race is better than another, that is the assumption of racism, that our knowledge system is priority, that our values are priority, and that we have to be careful of slogans such as "we are all in this together" may not actually be very helpful. That of course we are all in this together, for example in COVID-19, but we are not all in this together as experiencing it as the same level. That some of us are challenged in terms of our economies, that we may not all have connectivity to the internet, for example, that we don't all have Wi-Fi, that we don't all have luxurious laptops, tablets, cell phones that are hooked up to the internet, that for some reason our circumstances are what they are, and that we have to be careful that institutionally developed policies reflect these contexts and these communities and our needs. So racism may also mean that prejudice exists, discrimination exists, antagonism directed towards other people because they are of a different race or ethnicity. Many of us have talked about in the class, for example, about being treated poorly or treated differently because we are browner, because we are bigger, because we look different. We've been picked up by the police more than our friends that are Pākehā or of different ethnic groups. Where does this prejudice come from? And so we have to question again, why does racism exist? Where has it emerged from? Is it from a place of fear? Is it from a lack of education? Is it from poor socialization through systems such as the media, through the police, through communication, and so forth? And so we are always questioning, why are decisions made about specific ethnic groups if they are belittling them, or if they are bringing them down further than what we know? And so we are about justice in this course. We are about justice that elevates people, that enables people to be who they are without this prejudice and discrimination, that we have some form of action that can translate for people to have and exist as they are, without feeling that they are inferior because they may not speak English correctly, but because they or because they wear clothes that are not traditionally European or Western, that we have a different circumstance in terms of our cultural values. All of this needs to be taken into account, especially around education, but especially around this time of COVID-19, that we look and care for people that may not be experiencing the best possible life at this time. So racism can occur, of course, at the individual level. This is where individuals have the attitudes, or they do not acknowledge that that individuals live and learn and enact their own beliefs in a social environment. And so we have to add caution to that, especially if we are becoming the educators or the teachers or the health workers that will have a great influence on people's lives, so that we acknowledge the fact that there are certain forms of racial differentiation and discrimination in New Zealand society, and that there are specific institutions such as the media, such as schools, such as government departments, such as perhaps even universities, that don't recognize that people develop differently, that people have their own narratives, their own life stories, as you had presented in assignment 1, and that the one-size-fits-all formula may not even acknowledge these differences. So if we take this slide here about comfortability, if we were being quite personal, quite upfront as an activity in class or in tutorial, on a scale of 0 to 5, how comfortable are you talking about race or even racism? Explain. And on a scale of 0 to 5, how comfortable are you talking about racism? Explain. So we could ask ourselves this. Of course, for someone like myself who is an educator and who talks about racism and ethnicity and Indigenous lives and Pacific peoples, I'm very comfortable talking about race and racism. However, that may become more uncomfortable depending on the context. In a room where people don't get it, where I have to really explain things and get very heated and emotional and upset, I may become very uncomfortable, which could be a 1 or a 2. And so it would shift depending on the context. And I know in the past of my classes, I've had students say they've had very heated debates with their family members who come from the older generation, or with flatmates who have very negative or conservative views about ethnic groups, where they've tried to talk about and bring to the forefront notions of racism, and they've been very difficult conversations. These are difficult conversations to have, especially with our loved ones, where we still want to love them, but we still want to be able to talk freely about our learnings in the university. Now, there's another notion that comes out when we're talking about racism and race, and this is the racial othering. And some of you have heard me talk in the first few lectures about this notion of other. So we could add in the word here, racial othering. And so for some of us, when we fill out forms, if we take the most simplest sense, like the census or an enrollment form or a passport form, we were looking through the list of cultural identities, ethnic identities. I don't fit in that box, don't fit in that box, don't fit in that box. So hang on, I need to put in myself in the other box. So I tick the other, and then you state what you are. And in a way, this is about categorizing. So the use of the binary, the black, the white, notion of ethnicity and culture. And again, based on physical differences. And so this other, ticking the box as other, for example, doesn't even allow a Tahitian identity to come through. So this is where we challenge discourse, we just challenge language. So we challenge the production of knowledge through language. If we listen carefully to what is expressed through COVID-19, through media, through the narratives of the people on the streets and the neighborhoods, whose voice is being heard, whose knowledge is being represented, whose language is prioritized. And again, we air caution around blanket terms such as "we are all in this together," because then it tends to eliminate the diversities and the experiences of different people as we're going through this pandemic. And of course, I don't have to spend too much time on this. We are our own experts through this pandemic. We are living in it. We are experiencing a time as no other person before us has ever experienced. In some ways, I think about my mum who's passed away, and I think what would she be experiencing? What would she be encountering? What would she be thinking? And in a way, it's a blessing that she doesn't have to live through this because she had a lung disease. But now I'm living through it with my daughter, my husband, and my families. And what does that mean for our future generation? What are the learnings that we take from this, that we make the most of this opportunity of living, of existing, and how can we communicate a better life with others? So obviously COVID-19 as a pandemic presents immense health, medical, social challenges, um, but also people challenges. And unfortunately, we are now seeing more racism, more negativity around COVID-19 in terms of its emergence, its origination in China, Wuhan, in a wet market. And as COVID-19 has emerged, we have fear. We have fear of the unknown because it is a young disease, it is an emerging disease, and so we don't have a lot of data. We don't have a lot of research. We are still coming to grips with what it is and is about. We are seeing the geopolitics playing out in the media, which are the wars of words between the great big leaders in the world. We see people like the President of the United States, Donald Trump, taking stabs at China, and again letting the media hear this. And it is unfortunate because many people in the world that have access to radio or technology or communication become socialized through the media, and so what they hear suddenly connects with them and becomes that truth for that time. And so if we take this slide here, Alexa Alice German, Professor of English and International Affairs overseas, she states, here it is verbatim, the language of disease to racism is not a new phenomenon. For example, it was seen in an 1886 soap advertisement for kicking the Chinese out of the US, she said, and dubbed yellow fever in reference to white men who have a fetish for Asian women. It will take all of our cognitive ability, analytical reasoning to concentrate and harness our resources to combat disinformation, she said. Our greatest fight is about fear. And that is where racism comes from. It comes from a place of fear for many. It is coming from being the uneducated. It is coming from the unsocialized. It is coming from the unknown. And we will see that through media there will be different stories, different portrayals of Chinese, of Asians. I just remember back to some of the earlier clips, even on New Zealand media, when we started to close down the border, every media shot was of an Asian person coming into New Zealand. And so we think about those images that start to compound in some of our minds that, okay, then we start to associate COVID-19 with just Asian people. And then if we are already carrying some discrimination or prejudices, those will start to burn a little bit more and and become heightened in our minds. So we see racism, we see discrimination occurring, we see a surge of prejudice and discrimination. We prescribe this otherness, like the racial othering, to disease, to feel protected, to feel more safe. So we ascribe blame to justify a prejudicial rhetoric, in the sense that um, we believe something, we will blame something, somebody for this, and it could get worse if we don't do something about this in terms of our education through the media, through our schools, through our families, and so forth. And so remember that this course, multi-ethnic education, is not just about schooling. It is about our relationships with one another. It is about the informal learning, the non-formal learning that occurs, and that could be in our families, that could be in our villages, that could be in our neighborhoods and communities. It could be from reading a newspaper or something online or social media. And so we have to be cautious around the knowledge that is currently being presented around COVID-19 and people and ethnic groups and those who are disadvantaged in society. Because what does it create? It creates an isolation. So if we're thinking about this term bubble, we think about other bubbles or micro bubbles, where people become isolated through being discriminated against, through stigma, through xenophobia. That of course we will close our borders to the rest of the world to keep us safe, but we don't say that we close our borders because of Asians coming to our country. We can't say things like that. We have to be careful again about our explanation, about our reasoning, and our policies that are going to be presented through this pandemic. So we know that there will be consequences which will likely persist beyond the pandemic, because people will be hurt through this pandemic, through this process of loss, of grieving, of change, of uncertainty. And so people will be digging into themselves to find the answer and the resolution that may not always be the right answer. If we flick back to some of these articles, I won't click on these at the moment, but across the world, the global world, which is basically our neighborhood in some ways, we see that in some of the countries of the United States and the United Kingdom, some racial groups are more vulnerable. But it also, even in Aotearoa, New Zealand, we have a lot of our elderly Pasifika people in our homes, in our extended homes, who are over the age of 70, who have health conditions that are highly serious. We have seen Māori Ngāpuhi taking over control of their borders, for example, up north, through Hone Harawira and his hapu, and looking after their people. They refuse to allow tourists who are unwell through, or who have another agenda. So again, the protection of our people, because we can see that if we don't have the resources to get us through, then we are more vulnerable. We know that in my other course, Pacific Education, we see what the negative purple term was overcrowding, but we see that we live together in our homes, multiple people, and so we have to protect our people. And if we are the essential worker, if we are the nurses, or we are the cleaners, or other teachers, or the supermarket helpers, that we could be bringing back germs. And so if our houses are full of Pacific people or family members, again, we are at high risk, and we have to look after our people. And so late at night, Tangata Pasifika on one of the channels have a bulletin around 10:30. It's quite late, and around the COVID-19 levels and the conditions, and they're all presented in the different languages. So last night I was listening to Tongan, and then after that was Rotuman, Para Fiji, and so they will have the communication going on. And on the on Samoan Pacific Radio, we also have lots of communication as well. So again, the continual education, socialization that needs to come through different languages, not just in the one language, not just the one English language. One of my colleagues, Dr. Rawiri Taunui, if you look at the one his recent articles and um, awareness clips out to our Māori and Pacific communities, is that some of us in our Māori and Pacific communities have not been tested enough. And so one of the interesting media clips that came out a couple of weeks ago was that random testing was one of the first random testing episodes was going to happen in Queenstown. And then immediately we thought, okay, so what about South Auckland? Like, when was that going to happen? If we have vulnerable communities as well in those areas, is there going to be random testing? And so again, making sure that it just doesn't happen in one place or one area, that we are covering multiple areas with high needs, with more vulnerable populations as well. So let's recap again this course, this lecture about racism, COVID-19, and education. And as we are evolving people, as that we are people who have had experiences in our lives of our upbringing, of our circumstances, of our education, how does this help us to be who we are today? How does this help us influence others? How does this help us be the educators in terms of changing people's minds so that we can coexist together in COVID-19 as different peoples, not just as one people, but as different peoples who have our own contexts, communities, identities, needs, ways of learning, economic conditions, social conditions, and health conditions. And so that we all have an important role in being the educators. We don't necessarily have to be trained school teachers, but we are the people that can be supportive and embrace educating, the notion of educating others. We see the role of the media being particularly powerful at the moment in terms of communication. Remember all the 1 p.m. News sessions with Prime Minister Jacinda and Dr. Ashley Bloomfield, how that became a very important way of communicating ideas about COVID-19, about educating us through lockdown, about the expectations of government, about the health conditions of people, of how COVID-19 was progressing or regressing. That is a form of socialization. So education comes through different communication channels, whether it is just the one-to-one conversations, whether it is just the listening to the radio, or through watching social media, through reading the news. How do we challenge the false beliefs? How do we re-educate people around racism, being racist attitudes? Because we have had racism and we will continue to have racism, but we do not want experiences through COVID-19 to be the next laden or the next burden of racism for peoples. And also in the fact that our policies of our institutions must be reflective of the needs of people through difference, rather than through a one-size-fits-all approach. And so we have to have the greater awareness, the recognition of people's contexts and needs, that we see people for who they are through this process. And as we know, in being through as an education major or Pacific Studies major, that the role of the process of education through COVID-19, through schooling, through education, is that as people of our societies, our communities, and our neighborhoods, we have a responsibility to support each other and advocate for a better society. And your assignment too is a letter of advocacy, and I'll look at that more in the Zoom class on Monday, and also put up notes for those who can't access videos. So it is those with the loudest voice, the government and the media, who must speak out to condemn these actions around racism, around discrimination and judgment. And so we are educating public, we are protecting the vulnerable and holding people accountable for their prejudices and discrimination. And that beyond level 3 of COVID-19, as we re-emerge into a new phase of being together as people, that we again still remain accountable to one another to protect each other. We protect the vulnerable. We protect those who are experiencing extreme challenge upon challenge, and that we look after and care for them in the best way that we can as students of education, as students of multi-ethnic education, who strive to transcend difference, who strive to transcend boundaries that are visible and invisible, and that we come together in a connected way, in a connected virtual way at this stage, to test the waters, but to challenge those waters. And last year I was on a course, a year-long program or self-development titled Mana Moana, and Dr. Carlo Mila, who is our esteemed teacher in the course, is a phenomenal thinker and writer. And I just want to end this lecture with some of the writing that she quotes of the Samoan head of state, Tui Atua Tupoa Tamesese Te Isi Efi, who writes, "Piki piki hama vai vai manawa," is a Tongan saying that was taught to me by a Tongan friend. In Samoan, it is said, "Pi'ipi ama vai vai manawa." Hama in Tongan and ama in Samoan is the outrigger of the canoe. Piki piki in Tongan or pi'ipi in Samoan is hold on, and therefore the phrase means hold on to the outrigger. The outrigger symbolizes balance. Whenever there is movement, particularly rough movement inside the canoe or outside the canoe, as provoked by wave action, instinctively the fisherman holds on to the outrigger to retain balance. For the canoe to stay afloat, it is dependent on balance provided by the outrigger. Like the canoe, wisdom, knowledge, vision, indeed survival, is founded on balance. The words vai vai manawa mean the same in Tongan and Samoan. Vai vai is giving or sharing. Manawa is literally your stomach. Manawa, same spelling, different pronunciation, is also breathing. Manawa, manawa are core symbols in Polynesian expression. So as we go forth with EDUC 322 and the rest of our degree and the rest of this year, let us hold on to the outrigger. Piki piki hama vai vai manawa. So for our canoe to stay afloat, our waka to stay afloat, our waka to stay afloat, it is dependent on the balance provided by the outrigger. That outrigger is what will keep us balanced as we navigate these uncharted waters together. And like the canoe, our wisdom, our knowledge, vision, and survival will be founded on balance. So I will see you all very soon. Take care of yourselves, and I miss you tremendously. Look after one another. If you can, reach out to each other in some way, and be safe.